on human rights because of pressure from the military. I don't necessarily blame the president for this, the former president for this, but I think it was by virtue of the fact that the revolution which she led was a half-baked revolution that still allowed her to get pressured by these various groups.
Well, you know, that's an interesting term because in terms of half-baked, and well, what happened was Diokno and the other members of the Human Rights Commission resigned in protest over Mendiola.
Yeah, but also the vigilante groups that were being promoted by the military at the time.
And then this was a situation where the military, having gotten used to calling the shots during martial law, was in no mood to submit itself.
Yes.
Now, this brings up the interesting question that Ash was bringing up in his article, which is blame has to be assigned and responsibility taken. If you are going to have a situation where everyone sort of doesn't have to die.
Yes.
So is it really a question of being half-baked or unfulfilled in the sense of accountability?
But how would you hold, as you mentioned, how would you hold military officers who were used to absolute power in martial law during the time of Corazon Aquino? I don't think it would have worked possibly through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She would have had to do some firing. She would have had to do maybe some prosecutions. But then you ask the question, what would that have done to her regime? And what would that have done to our democracy?
So you're contending, I mean, having studied the era, that, for example, the Chilean model where no one really had to suffer for the military's handling of things, but there were sort of amnesties made, and just to sort of put on paper that there are things that required some sort of
maybe perhaps actually maybe perhaps it would have worked. So for example, if you had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about a lot of military violations during the time of Marcos, a lot of these former military officers might not have become senators of the Republic, or might have not become congressmen of the Republic, and might not hold the kind of influence they hold today, even if they wouldn't be in jail necessarily.
Well, this brings up an interesting point in that there's also a sort of manifestation of how the public solves these problems. You had these putschists who revolted against the government, and the first thing the public does is elect them to office. Is that the Peter principle at work, where you, fine, okay, you want to influence things, get into public office and let's see what happens.
I don't know why they got elected, actually. For me, well, there's been work as to why they got elected. They were saying that a lot of these putschists were feeding into the action movie narrative of that time, that Gringo Nasan kind of looked like one of those action stars, and that he seemed like a true nationalist. I don't think these things would have been possible, these narratives that allowed them to get elected. I don't think these would have been possible if, again, we resolved certain issues, like perhaps maybe a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
But then we view elections. I mean, both the candidates, and I think in many ways the public views elections as referendums on each of these people and what they've done. I mean, that's why Estrada had his wife and his son run. It was a validation of his popularity. For those accused of collaboration against the Japanese, they would run for office to prove that the public still accepted them. So is there this dynamic as well? And
well, definitely the first election, for example, after People Power, the first senatorial election was roughly established Cory Aquino's mandate, because every one of her, except one, I think, every one of her senators won. And then slowly you had that number dwindling. But you know, that still extended until '92 with the election of Ramos. And so that validated to a large extent Cory Aquino. And I think that that's what allows us to view that period in time with a certain degree of fondness, because it's been validated by these elections as well.
Now, Ash was pointing out two ways to sort of prevent this sense of disillusionment from sinking in after an exercise in people power. The first was a Truth Commission. The second was this concept of a genuine rule of law. Now, we've sort of been going away from that, and in a sense, many of the crises that have been triggered, EDSA Tres, as you point out, was as much a protest against what they viewed as an abuse of the legal system, that basically you were kicking Estrada when he was down.
But I think if you look at People Power 1, though, it did allow for a greater respect of the rule of law. So for instance, one of the things that People Power 1 did was that it led directly to the collapse or the split of the Communist Party of the Philippines, which made that avenue less acceptable to many people. And what that did was you had all these former cadres, for example, who started participating in NGOs and people's organizations and started working with the institutions. And I think that's also a legacy of people power, one that we have to acknowledge, that people working with these institutions right now who would have been cadres 30 years ago are now out in the open, running for elections or working for government institutions or working for NGOs.
But at the same time, you have their experience once they enter government that old habits die hard for those who wield power and have tasted it. So, for example, even if you have a system that is supposed to provide for the rule of law, when a challenge, precisely as you pointed out, for transparency or accountability comes out, then all sorts of stratagems are come up, and the result is people start expressing outrage again. Or, on the other hand, some say fewer and fewer people are capable of outrage. So which is it?
Well, I think that's why a lot of people are clamoring for unity, and I think that's what explains the surge of popularity of Noynoy Aquino, because people see that people have different agenda, and they find in this one person a symbol through which all those agenda can be united. Now there's a problem with that, and I call that the Barack Obama phenomenon. When you treat somebody as a symbol, and suddenly you read into that symbol everything you want that symbol to be because you want to get united, and eventually that will lead to disillusion, which is what's happening with Obama right now, which is the problem that I think the Aquino campaign needs to confront, I think, because he's viewed as a symbol, but people are just basically reading what they want into this figure.
And a candidate isn't a magic slate.
And a
he
candidate
has to
is the magic
lay
slate,
out what do they stand for.
Yeah.
So thanks. If people want to read more, where do you suggest they go?
Well, I think they should first read certain articles by Mark Thompson if they want to look at the legacy of people power. But that's those articles endorse the point of view that the Aquino administration was good for democracy. But there are some more critical articles, for example, In the Name of Civil Society by Eva Lotte Hedman, which basically says that the...
And these can be found online?
This can be, this is a book. What can be found online is the classic Cacique Democracy in the Philippines, though, which is a very cynical take on EDSA by Benedict Anderson.
Okay, thanks for being with us. Thank you, Lalo. I'm Manolo Quezon, and this has been The Explainer. That's good.